All right. Thanks everyone for joining. The topic for our webinar today is modernizing the job reviews process. So quick overview of what we'll cover today. We'll give you a quick introduction of both myself and Jason. We'll then dive into why job reviews are important. And then we're going to get out of the PowerPoint slides and really focus more on some of the tools you can utilize. So how you can streamline your WIP report, what does a modern cost to complete analysis look like? And then we'll also spend some time analyzing the project billings. And then we'll save the last few minutes at the end to conclude with a Q&A. So if you have questions as we're going through them, please go ahead and log them in the Q&A chat down at the bottom of your screen. We're going to hold all the questions at the end, but we will spend a few minutes at the end addressing any of those questions you do have. So yeah, real quick introductions. My name is Kevin Bright. I am a product manager with ProNovos. I've been with ProNovos for about 2 years now, but before I worked for ProNovos, I was actually in the construction industry myself. I was a project manager for a California-based commercial contractor for just about 7 years. So, oversaw probably a couple dozen different projects and had a good amount of experience, good and bad, in the construction industry and kind of all the different challenges that come with it. And joining me today is Jason Bainter. Jason is a CPA at Somerset. And Jason, I'll give you a chance to give a quick introduction to yourself.
So I'm a senior manager on our construction and A&E team here at Somerset. I've been with them for about 15 years now. I've been a CPA for about 23 years and in the construction industry for about 18 years, practicing as a CPA, working with contractors, analyzing the working process and everything that goes with the WIP. So,
nice. Yeah, and we're super fortunate to have Jason here with us today. I certainly come from the construction side of things and have that construction perspective, but it's always nice to have someone like Jason on these webinars to give more of that accounting perspective and really what are people looking at when you look at your project financials. One thing we're going to do real quick is I'm going to launch a poll question. If you could take a few seconds to respond to the poll as we kind of continue on here, that'd be great. All right, so let's get into the meat of it. Why is the job reviews process important? And really what you're looking to do is answer a few critical questions about your projects. So the first one, the most basic one, is understand how is your job performing, right? And that's very simple. Let's look at the job cost to date. I want to know what I've spent on the job up to this point. The next one is understand how a job is being financed. And that's where we're really going to dive into those over/under billings. Are you sufficiently billing the contractor where they're able to cover your cash flow on the project? Or are you behind on your billings and you're having to go out of pocket to make sure those costs are covered? The next one is understand what still needs to happen on a project. So that's where we talk about our cost to complete. All right, if we know what our job cost to date is, the next question is going to be, okay, what are we going to spend in our cost to complete the project? And then that leads us to our next question of where will a project finish? And this is where we talk about what is that projected final cost going to be, what's that final projected or profit margin on a project going to be, really understanding how that job is going to perform at the end of the job. So to get that projected final cost, you're going to take your job cost, your cost to complete, what's your projected final cost, divide it by your revised contract to get that profit margin. And then the very last thing that I think is really important to discuss when you do a job reviews process, and I think this is probably the one that people miss the most, is a root cause analysis. And that is because job reviews it's a really good opportunity to take some of the hard-earned lessons on a specific project and make sure you are learning from them, that you are embedding that into a feedback loop into your organization. So on the next project, if you run into those same issues, you understand how you can respond to them. And you really understand why projects are finishing the way they are. It's always good to understand how much money you made on a project, but if you don't understand why you did or how you got there, then you're really kind of moving through the dark moving forward. So spending the time to actually say, okay, not only what is our profit margin going to be, but how did we get there? Why did we get there? That's a really important step that I think a lot of people overlook when they do these job review types of discussions. All right, and with that said, we're gonna stay out of the slides. I don't like spending too much time in the slides, and we're gonna get directly into some of the tools. So The first one we're going to look at is the WIP report, which is I think where most people start when they do their job reviews. So Jason, I'm going to toss it over to you because I'm curious from your perspective, when you look at a WIP report, what are some of the things that you're looking for?
So when we do a review or an audit for a construction client, one of the first things we really look at is the projected profit margin on jobs. What we like to look at is the average gross margin on jobs. In this example, the average margin's 22.1%. And what we really like to do is then do a variance analysis, and any jobs that are plus or minus 5% of that average margin, we want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into and understand why the margins may be higher or lower. The jobs with higher margins above that average, those are kind of like your best in class jobs. You've gotten a really larger margin than the average, and you want to look and see what have you been doing well on those type of jobs that maybe may flow over into other jobs where you can maybe save on costs, save on labor. And then on the reverse side, that minus 5% of the average margin, why are those jobs having lower margins than the average of all jobs? Though, again, we go back to Kevin's root cause analysis. What's causing those jobs to see a lower margin? Is it overtime on the jobs? Did materials come in higher than what it was estimated? As we know, with the supply chain issues we've recently had, there's a lag time on getting equipment and material to jobs. So those material costs are probably increasing, which is then decreasing your projected profit margin on those jobs.
Yeah, and I think that's really well said. And I think this is where we start to bridge into where you can kind of take that bridge from the accounting to the project management team. And you really want to focus on that profit margin and how it can change. And one thing that I think is always really useful when you look at this here, if I click into a job here, what I'm going to see is that my pull up on the side is I can see the past adjustments that we've made on this project to see how it's changed over time. So I'm looking historically, how has my projected profit or projected final cost changed? And then down below, I can see how that profit margin has changed in time. So at a real quick high level, I can very quickly see not only, okay, where's this job today, but how did it get here? And I think this is where I'd like to spend a little bit more time now in terms of, okay, it's great to be able to track this, but how do you really want to generate that value of a projected final cost? So we're going to hop to our next tool here. And this is what we call at ProNovos as your projected final cost. And really what this is, it's meant to be an exercise for the project manager to go through their job costs in detail, line item by line item, and update what they think that projected final cost is going to be. So at the top of the page, what you can see is some of that top level summary information. So we can see our contract amount, our budget, job cost to date, any outstanding commitments. And then critically, what we can see is what was our revised margin based on the contract amount and the budget. And this is really what we're going to be monitoring here as we're making adjustments on the page. So over on the right is I've got my margin tracker. And what it's going to tell me is based on the adjustments I'm making below at the line item, what is my projected final cost going to be? And then based on that projected final cost, I know what my projected final margin is going to be. So if I'm showing a projected final cost of $704,000, that means my margin is going to finish at 15%. And that's going to be a profit margin fade of 6.57% from that original 21.62% margin. So that's really what we're looking for when we're going through this exercise is how is that profit margin being impacted? So now if we go down to the actual meat of the report here, there are a few different ways a project manager can update their projected final cost. The very first most basic one is you can simply click on an item here and update it. So let's say my original projected final cost was 10,000. I say, you know what, I think that was light. I actually think I'm going to finish at 15,000. You can start to type it in and it's going to tell you what your adjustments are here. So now I can see I'm going to finish $10,960 over budget. That means my cost to complete on this line item is $11,976. So as I'm making the adjustments in real time, I can see how that's going to impact all the different parameters of that line item. And I would say if you're going through and you're updating the projected final cost, doing that lump sum adjustment, that's a really good thing to do, but it's always not going to be the best because usually it's going to be a bit of a gut check, right? You know, you're kind of saying, hey, you know, I had a $10,000 original projected final cost. Maybe I think I'll finish at 15,000. There's really not a lot of science to it. So there's a few other ways that you can update your projected final cost. And one of them would be updating your cost to complete. So let's say I don't know necessarily what my final number is going to be, but I know I've got one more invoice that's got to come in and it's going to be about $5,000. I can type that in and I can see how that's going to impact my projected final cost. The third way is if you don't know necessarily, all right, what my cost to complete is, you may know gut check wise, you know, what's your percent complete? So if I go in here and say, all right, rather than 30% complete, I am actually 50% complete. I can go in here and it says, all right, if it took you $3,000 to be 50% complete, that means it's going to take you another $3,000 to be 100% complete. So your projected final cost is now going to be $6,048. So those are some of the modifications you can use focusing on specifically the cost side of it. If it is a labor line item, there's a few other ways that you can modify your projected final cost. And the first one's going to be updating your projected final hours. So you might say, okay, I don't know what my projected final cost is, but I know what my projected final hours is going to be. So let's use the same line item again and say, all right, right now my projected final hours is 397. If I think it's going to be only 300, I can type in 300 and I'm going to see what those adjustments are. So now my costs are going to finish at 7,560. Again, kind of similar with cost. I don't think people intuitively know what their projected final hours are going to be. More realistically, what they're going to know is how many hours do they need to complete. So they might say something like, hey, I've got 3 guys on site for one more week out there. That's 120 hours. Let me put in my 120 hours to complete. It's going to multiply that by your labor rate to get to your projected final cost. So it's a really good way to say, okay, you may not know how much more cost you have to complete in a line item, but you might know how much more time you need to complete that line item. So that's a good way to kind of back into it by entering those hours. The last way to do it, I'm going to find a good line item example here. And I would say this is the gold standard. It is updating your quantity complete. So rather than saying how many hours do I have left or what's my cost to complete, it's actually looking at what is the quantity you need to produce of something on the job site and how much have you produced to date. So if we look at this line item here, we can see we have a budget of 100 cubic yards. It looks like it's a concrete line item. If I go in here and I complete this, or if I update this to say I'm actually 60 cubic yards complete, it's going to tell me what that final cost is going to be. So now I can say, all right, based on that, my job to date cost is $896. That's going to give me a $1493. And the reason that I think using your quantity complete is kind of the gold standard is twofold. One, it's going to be the most accurate, right? If you're actually counting what you've gotten done on the job site, that's going to be way more accurate than trying to figure out what your costs are. And the second reason is you can start to leverage production rates. And when you start using production rates, it really gives you a lot of insight, not only into how you're performing on a job, but also some corrective action you can take. So if I click into this line item here, what I can see is I can see what my hourly production rate is. So my budgeted rate, so if I say, all right, I had 100 cubic yards and 54 hours, my budget production rate is to do 1.85 cubic yards per hour. And then I can look at my actual. So my actual is, okay, in 32 hours, I've done 45 cubic yards. So my actual is 1.4 cubic yards per hour. So I can see on my production rate on an hourly basis, I'm behind schedule. So that's really powerful information I get right off the start. But then where it gets even more interesting is when you start to use what's called a recovery rate. And a recovery rate basically says, okay, based on the quantity I've done to date, what do I have to do on the remaining hours I have available in this budget to make sure I hit this original 100 cubic yards in 54 hours? So what I'm looking at here is I basically need to do 3 cubic yards in the remaining 22 hours to make sure I finish on time and on schedule here. So now we're looking at like, okay, not only am I behind, but what do I need to do to catch up? So the next thing we can look at here is right now we're looking at production rates on an hourly basis. And I don't know about everyone else on the call, but usually when I look at something hours, it's not easy to wrap my head around. What's much more easy if you look at it at a man day or a crew day level. So if I look at it for my crew days, I can go into the settings here and I can set what my crew size is. So I'm going to have a 2-man crew. They're going to work 8 hours a day. And basically that's what that's going to tell me is that how much cubic yards do I need to do per crew per day? And this way I can start to look at it at a more, rather than saying, all right, I need to do 2 cubic yards per hour, that's not really how concrete pours work. It's much easier to say, all right, at the end of the day, what do I need to produce? So I can say, all right, I need to do about 30 cubic yards a day to make sure I'm meeting my budget. And you can go in here and it will work the same way down here where rather than seeing your hours budget, you can see your crew date budget. And then if you want to update your projected final hours, you can click in here and say, all right, let's say instead of taking 4.5 crew days, I think it's going to take 8 crew days. This gets into the last part of what you really want to capture when you do that, or when you do that projected final cost. So when you're doing that projected final cost, you can go in here and say, all right, now that I've made my adjustment, I don't think it's going to take me 4.5 crew days. I think it's going to take me 8 crew days. I can select what the reason is for that. So maybe there was poor coordination. I can add any comments to it. I can see that going from 4.5 crew days to 8 crew days means I'm going to increase my projected final cost by $1,584. So it's telling me how I'm doing it in real time. You can see here if I change that to 12, I can now see I'm going to increase my projected final cost by $3,376. So using crew days, using some of these other ways to look at it really gives you a quick way to update it. But really the important part here is capturing that root cause analysis, understanding, okay, why is it taking longer than we thought? And I think this is where a lot of the analysis long-term gets really insightful, where you can start to kind of pull back at a 10,000-foot level and say, all right, across all our projects, what are kind of the primary root causes that are leading us to go over budget? Let's say, for example, you are continually having missing information as a lot of root cause reasons. Well, that's going to tell you, hey, maybe there's something in terms of how you're getting information out to the job site. Either they don't have the correct plans they need, or maybe you're not doing a good job on your RFI process. It gives you that insight into what are some of these processes that you need to clean up. The other thing I'll note here is everyone likes to focus on, okay, why did we go over budget? What's the reason we did that? I would argue what's equally important is if you save money on a job, understanding what are the reasons that you saved money on a job. So let's say you were able to do something a little bit faster, and the reason you did that was because you had design-related improvements on it. You came up with a better way to basically install that material. And if you did that on one project, you're going to want to take those same design improvements and roll them out to the next project. So it really gives you a good way to basically say, okay, what did we do right on this project? And let's make sure we capture that so we can do it on future jobs as well. So that's basically the idea of how you would go through and update your projected final cost, some of the different ways you can do it, some of the insights you're looking for. And then really what you're looking for is once you finish that process and you say, okay, this is my final number, I think that's good, 704,398. You can go in here and say, that's the number that I want to update on my WIP. You're going to update it. And then if I go back to my WIP, whoops. We can see that number that the project manager updated right here. So that gives you that kind of full picture of, all right, we're starting at the WIP, we're looking for what some of those problem projects might be, where might a project end up, and then we're getting into the very granular detail of that project to understand what our job costs are and where our projected final costs might be. I know I just spent a lot of time talking, so Jason, I'm going to turn it back over to you here. Now that we've kind of talked specifically about projected final costs and profit margins, what are some other things that you look for on the WIP?
So the other things that kind of tie in all together is over and under billings, job borrow, and then basically the cash graph that is within ProNovos. But we really, over billings, we don't dig too deeply in because we want to see contractors have overbillings. Having an overbilling means that the customer is typically paying the job, paying for the job. Whereas having underbillings, that really means that you're not billed to progress and the company is having to pay for the job, the material, the labor, all of that, which is not good for the company. I mean, that creates some cash flow issues. The company may have to dig into the line of credit to pay for the jobs. And also underbillings could be an identification that there's a loss on the job. So we really are going to dig into those underbillings that are significant or material to the financial statements to find out just what's causing those underbillings. Most of the times it is going to be an issue of time. Just maybe the contract says you can only bill every 15th of the month. So if you put a lot of costs into the last 15 days of the month, you're not going to be billed to progress until the next month when you bill. However, those other instances will, the client just has not identified those cost overruns properly. So there is a real loss on the job. Those are the types of questions and jobs we want to really look at. And then the job borrow kind of goes into the same circumstance. Are you, as the company, able to cash flow this project through the billings, or are you having to pay it out of your own pocket and possibly have to borrow from other jobs to pay for the current job that's not billed to date? And in past webinars, we've seen the money graph or the cash graph, and that kind of gives you a timeline of when costs have come in, when cash has come in, when billings have went out. And as long as we are seeing cash come in at a faster pace than costs are going out, then we're going to be cash positive. And the client will be cash flowing that job versus the company have to cash flow it.
Yeah, and I think that's I know when I was a project manager, that was something that always took me a while to wrap my head around, with the idea of over under billings and how that impacts, you know, the cash position on a project. I always thought just like, hey, if I overbilled, I'm good. And then, you know, I remember the first time my CFO explained to me, oh, over billings, they're good, but they're also considered a liability. You know, not having that accounting background, my head kind of exploded. So I think it really took me a while to really understand the importance of over under billing. So one thing I wanted to highlight here in the last few minutes is what are some tools that a project manager can use to really understand what's going on with their project billings. So what we're going to look at here is what we call the project billing dashboard. And this is a tool that a project manager can use to understand, okay, what is driving that over under billing. So we're going to look at that 21002. We can see we've got a $19,000 under billing on the project. If I look at this dashboard here, what I can quickly see here is, first off, I haven't billed yet this month. So this might be what Jason's talking about is, hey, the reason we have the underbilling is we can only bill on the 20th every month and we haven't submitted our billing yet. Where you want to start getting into a little more detail is when you look at what your costs in that month are. So I have $9,000 in costs in the month. And what we can look at is basically based on what your budget and your contract amount is, what do you need to bill in that month to make sure you don't end up with a net underbilling on the project? So if I have $9,000 in costs, that means I need to bill at least $11,000 this month to make sure I don't have a net underbilling for the current month. So we can quickly see here, all right, if I have a $19,000 underbilling and I still need to bill $11,000 this month. And that means there's still $8,000 in that underbilling that's unexplained by the cost that I've incurred this month. It's probably a carryover from the previous month. So that means I got to dig into it. Is it because I didn't bill as much as I should have in the previous month? I can start to look at what my schedule of values are. Maybe I'm a little light on one of them. Or maybe it's what Jason was saying, that it's an early sign that we might have an overrun on the project. And I need to go back to that projected final cost tool and update it accordingly to make sure that I'm tracking it correctly. Some other really good information on this chart is this right here, your average days to pay. So you can get a sense of how quickly the client pays. I think that's something that people always battle with, is getting timely payments from their contractors. So this is a really good way so you can kind of see, okay, are they paying every 30 days, every 45 days? So you can be a little more proactive and say, okay, if they're taking 60 days to pay, I know I need to be more aggressive on my billings because I'm going to be going longer periods between when I get my payments, and I need to make sure I have enough cash on hand to finance the job. And then the very last thing, this is the money graph Jason was talking about. I think it's a really good tool for project managers to look at. Basically, it's a timeline view of how much have you billed, what's your cost, and what's your cash. So you can kind of see how quickly it takes you to get cash flow positive on a project. And then also, are you cash flow positive? So are your costs above what that cash is, even if you're over or under billed on the project? All right, so going back to the WIP one more time, Jason, I'll let you finish with any closing thoughts. I don't know if there's any last things you wanted to touch on, and then we'll turn to Q&A.
The only thing I'd really close on is we've went through a lot of data points, and data is knowledge. The more data you have, the better. You can explain jobs, whether they were really good or had poor performance with data. And the other issue is just knowing where your job is in progress. If you mistakenly over progress your jobs, that's going to affect your billings and your projected final costs. It can affect your profit and loss on the overall company's financials. So just knowing where at you're on a job is definitely needed, and all this information that we've shown just helps be able to provide better answers to what created the higher margins, what created the lower margins, the overbillings, the underbillings. So it's all a lot of information, but all of that information is knowledge. So
yeah, I think that's really well said. The more data you're looking at, the more frequently you're looking at it, the more on top of a project you're going to be. And I can't tell you, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call can relate to this. Typically, in my experience, when a project goes wrong in construction, it's very rarely because people didn't know what they were doing. It's usually because people didn't catch things in time. And if they were paying more attention to their job costs, if they were paying more attention to some of the different metrics that you can look at on a job, chances are they could have caught things earlier and taken corrective action and kind of cut that off before it got away from them. All right, so we'll spend the last couple of minutes here answering any questions people have. If you have any questions, feel free to either or to drop it in the Q&A down at the bottom. The first question I see is, does this work with the accounting system the business uses for daily updates to projects? Yeah, so basically what we do is we would connect to the accounting system, and we would pull your data on every night. So every midnight, we would go in and say, all right, any new data, we're going to pull that into ProNovos to make sure all the data is up to date. Second question, can you change the metrics that are shown at the top of this WIP? So the ones on the WIP here, these are fixed ones on project manager and project class. One nice feature that you can do for these is if I wanted to see the projects for a certain project manager, for example, like if I click on Paul Cookoff, what it will do is it'll filter all the projects based on him. So you aren't able to change these two KPIs up at the top here. What I will say though is we have a full analytics suite package where if you go to the analytics page here, there's over a dozen different dashboards with different KPIs and charts showing you different performance across your jobs that you can look at. So even if the analytics and KPIs you're looking for aren't on the WIP report, we probably have them in one of the other dashboards floating around. Is there a way for a project manager or controller to see the information in ProNovos so they only see their jobs? Yes. So everything in the system is controlled through permission settings. So you can either turn certain tools on or off for people. So let's say you wanted your project managers to do the projected final cost, but you didn't want them to see the WIP. You could turn the WIP off for them. And then you can also control it at a project access level. So if they only have 3 projects and you only want them to see those 3 projects, you can only give them, or you can give them access only to those 3, and then all the other projects they would not be able to see. Do you have a dashboard that shows trends on forecasted margin costs? Yes, so you can look at, let me go back to the WIP for a second. So if I look at the WIP here, I can see how that profit margin has changed over time. So you can kind of see, all right, if I started at looks like a 10.5% profit margin, I can see how that's changed. And then if I scroll down, I can see how my job costs have modified on the job over time. And that will also take into account commitments. If you just wanted to see when a job cost happen on a job, you have this job cost graph here. So you can kind of quickly see, okay, am I spending my job costs on a routine basis, or are they kind of front loaded, back loaded? And these are only a few different graphics. There's a few others. One that we didn't have a chance to get into today is we have one dashboard that looks at change orders, and it will do the same thing where it will basically look at how your change orders have come across on the project and how that's impacted your profit margin. So let's say you bid a job at a 20% profit margin, but you can only submit change orders at a 15% markup. It's going to tell you based on your approved change orders, how has that affected your profit margin on a project. All right, I don't think I see any more questions. So I think we're 3 minutes over, so we'll let everyone get back to the day. Jason, thank you again so much for joining us. I think this was great. It's always great to hear your insight on these topics.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a good one.
Bye.